Imprisoned and Segregated by Ed Mead. It was a dark and ominous day when the prison's bus pulled up to transfer me and 20 other prisoners to the Washington State Penitentiary at Walla. Actually, I do remember what the weather was like that day, though it was 20 years ago and the weather was one of the last things on my mind. As it happens, it was a beautiful summer day in early August 1976 when we left Shelton's reception units. The penitentiary was located in the opposite corner of the state, as far away from Seattle as possible. Low rolling thunderclouds hovered over the whole area as our bus drew nearer and nearer to the prison. The wind blew in earthy-smelling gusts. I experienced the feeling one gets just before an electrical storm, sensing the yet-to-be-discharged static electricity as it filled the hot afternoon air, as if looking for some channel through which to discharge its pent-up energy. The atmosphere added a sense of dread to an already muggy day. A storm was certainly looming. The relatively short amount of time I had to spend at the Shelton Correction Center's reception units was delightfully uneventful. Shelton is where new inmates coming into the state's prison system are initially housed and processed. The short-timers are weeded out and scheduled for transfer to minimum or medium custody facilities, while those serving long terms are sent to the Walls, as the penitentiary at Walla is called. The Walls was considered to be the toughest, roughest, highest security prison in the state, the government's ultimate revenge, the end of the line, and the last stop for many men. I knew it might be that for me, not only because of my long prior record, but also because I had a new sentence of 2 consecutive life terms. I had just finished 8 months of difficult confinement in Seattle's King County Jail. During that time, I went through both the state and federal trials and the respective sentencing procedures. The barbarity of the jail experience would prove to be just a warm-up for what was to come. While in the jail, I was locked up in what they then called the Annex, which was a section of the jail used as a segregation unit. I did not start out in the hole, but a fellow prisoner, Mark LaRue, who was certainly well-meaning but nonetheless a bit of a bumbler, decided to send me a note outlining a plot to riot and escape. I was in the jail's mess hall having a meal and minding my own business. Mark walked by the table I was eating at, and as he passed, he dropped the incriminating note on the floor, the one outlining his grand scheme to riot, take hostages, escape, etc. The only problem was that the guards became aware of the note before I did, and they snatched it up before I could get to it. That was the end of my stay in the jail's main population. It was the death knell to any escape plans I may have been visualizing in my own head. In the Annex, where I was to spend the remainder of my time in the King County Jail, the walls and the ceilings of the cells were made of metal, and if an inmate beat on them just right, they would reverberate with a resonance that would shake much of the building. We did not put this knowledge into practice until our treatment in the Annex became so bad that we were forced to initiate a series of protests. First, we did do some serious banging on the walls. The noise soon became so bad that the judges in the courtrooms located below the jail started complaining to the guards, demanding that they do something about it. And they did, by running in on us with pressurized, gallon-sized jugs of mace, a chemical agent that burns the eyes and lungs, which was supposedly designed to be used only in open areas to disrupt street riots and whatnot. They must have pumped gallons of mace in on us in an area with no air circulation except what little came in through the Annex's solid steel door, which was usually open. After the macing, though, the door was closed and we were left to cook in the foul, gaseous air for nearly 24 hours. They pumped the stuff in through the vents at the back of our cells. As they squirted the irritating agent through the top vent of my cell, I would jump up on my bunk and try to cover the opening with a towel to prevent it from entering the cell. Then they would shoot the stuff in through the bottom vent. When I dropped down to cover that one, they would squirt the mace into my cell from the top vent again. And while one guard was doing that to my cell, faceless others were in the plumbing walkway behind the cells doing the same thing to all the other men on the tier. When they finally left us alone, the floors and walls of our cells were dripping with mace, and our mattresses and bedding was soaked with the stuff. We were left to cook in the unventilated summer heat of the Annex until nearly noon of the following day. I had witnessed the beating of prisoners and many other less dramatic crimes against prisoners at the King County Jail, conditions which apparently became even worse later. As always seems to happen, when the beating of prisoners fails to cause a desired behavior, guards take to killing them. After I left the jail, I read that guards used the infamous chokehold to kill some black prisoners. The guards, like their police counterparts in the streets, were routinely found using justified force in the murder of unarmed captives. This form of legalized murder has an effect more immediate than the simple killing of a recalcitrant prisoner, in that it works to communicate to other captives the high cost of being insufficiently submissive. I was in the jail with 2 life sentences given to me by the state. The terms would probably have been half that except for my big mouth. My trial attorney, David Allen, talked to the judge before I was sentenced and was told that he, the judge, was going to impose a single life sentence. Armed with that knowledge and angry with the severity of even that much time, at sentencing the next day, when the court asked me if I had anything to say, I told him, "I have been framed and railroaded, like all poor people who appear before this court." The trial judge then turned a livid red. He was clearly flustered as he stammered through the imposition of 2 consecutive life terms. The way I saw it was that one of the life sentences was for the assaults, and the other was for the crime of having a smart mouth. In a country espousing free speech, no one deserves a life sentence for something they have merely said, especially since what I said was true. I never did have a police officer in my gun sights. I was not trying to kill or even wound anyone. I was trapped in the bank with no means of escape. It would have been stupid for me to try and shoot someone at that point. My gunfire was merely a means to secure a negotiated surrender, to let the murderous police know that this was not going to be a slaughter. The prosecutor's version of events was substantially different, of course. He said that on January 23, 1976, the defendants attempted to rob the Tukwila branch of the Pacific National Bank of Washington. They were armed with a 9mm automatic, a .38 caliber revolver, and a sawed-off shotgun. The purpose of the robbery was to take money to purchase automatic weapons and explosives to further the actions of the George Jackson Brigade. Detective Joseph Matthews of the Tukwila Police Department arrived in front of the bank, and the defendant and Seidel began to shoot him. Detective Matthews returned the fire and hit Seidel. Simultaneously, a 4th robber, waiting across the street, began to fire at Detective Matthews. Detective Matthews returned 2 rounds in this direction, and the other person left. At this time, Officer Robert Abbott arrived, and Seidel fired 1 round at him, knocking out a light on the patrol car. Abbott then returned fire with 1 round, which struck Seidel in the chest and killed him. It has been this official version of the incident that I've had to live with during the subsequent course of my incarceration. The sentences handed down in those days were really capricious. For example, there is a guy in the jail with me who had a long history of killing and raping women. They convicted him for doing that to several women in the state. He received a single 5 to life term, whereas I, who had never harmed anyone or had never before been so much as arrested for a crime of violence, was stuck with 2 20 to life beefs running wild. Hell, Cuban exile Virgilio Paz Romero, who was convicted and sentenced in federal court for the 1976 planting of a car bomb that killed former Chilean ambassador Orlando Letelier and his assistant, Lonnie Moffett, in Washington, D.C., Romero received a 12-year term for those 2 murders. With a 3rd deducted for good time, the very most he would have to serve would be 8 years. According to the U.S. government's Bureau of Justice Statistics, more than half the convicted murderers released from state prisons in 1983 were back on the streets after spending less than 7 years behind bars. I am not saying these people are serving too little time, as murderers have the lowest recidivism rate of any other offender. What I am saying is that my state sentence was too harsh. So, from the jail I went to Shelton. I don't remember much about life there other than being locked up in a cell much of the time. They did call me in one day to take a psychological test, the MMPI, which is based on the outlook of some white middle-class farmers in Minnesota. If you don't answer these questions like the white farmers would, then you are considered abnormal. And not being normal or average in America is nearly a crime. So there we were, a whole room full of newly arrived prisoners and a couple of non-uniformed cops, no doubt counselors of some sort. They passed out a copy of the test to each of us and told us to complete all of the questions. I immediately refused to take the test, telling the guy that doing so would be a violation of my rights to privacy. One of the cops then told me I must take it. I again declined. He then became even more verbally insistent. I told him that if he wants me to take the test, he is going to have to physically pick up my hand and make a mark on the answer sheet, as I won't do it on my own. He saw I was serious and ordered me out of the room. I had entertained a hope that some of the other prisoners would follow suit, but none did so. Like obedient sheep, they all submitted to the invasion of their most private thoughts by the state. Guess it was all their training in school that conditioned them in this regard. Some years later, in connection with pending litigation, I was able to obtain copies of documents setting out what the testers had to say about me. They said, psychological tests were refused. He claims the tests are irrelevant, inaccurate, outdated, and an invasion of his personal privacy. His attitude was adamant refusal without compromise. He was released from testing. Actually, refusing to subject myself to the testing was a smart move on my part, but I followed it up with something stupid. I was called in for a psychological interview by Shelton psychologist Felix E. Macia and psychiatrist P. B. Smith. I don't know why I agreed to talk to them, perhaps because I had been ambushed rather than given the time to think about whether or not I wanted to talk to them. They did a 3-page report on me that was not all that negative, but that would later be misused by the state's parole board. What the report said, in essence, is that I saw myself as a revolutionary. That should not come as any surprise to people. They said I came across as, quote, a relaxed, affable, and articulate individual. Mr. Mead presented himself as a revolutionary who was imprisoned by his captors, as he perceived himself as being at war with society's institutions and systems. The part of this July 26, 1976 psychological report that really hurt me was when the interviewers said, quote, Mr. Mead presented himself much as he did in court, where he viewed his actions in his war as being justified, thus his robbing of a bank being an appropriate expropriation, and his setting of bombs which destroyed the Laurelhurst power substation, as well as the offices of the Division of Adult Corrections in the Capitol Center building in Olympia, as an acceptable tactic in his fight. Mr. Mead acknowledged by intimation that his group in this area was linked with the groups that have identified themselves as being part of the George Jackson Brigade in other areas such as California, where they were involved in a bombing in San Francisco and banks in Santa Barbara. No group in any other part of the country, Santa Barbara or elsewhere, ever claimed to be a part of the George Jackson Brigade. Moreover, the brigade never conducted any bombing actions outside of Washington state. But the parole board would subsequently use this bogus information against me, claiming that the quoted material constituted confession to all those crimes. That it was patently false on its face carried no weight at all. The psychological report concluded by saying that he does not primarily fit into any particular category of the DNSM, a diagnostics manual used by psychologists, as he is difficult to pigeonhole, as he has a great deal of insight and is very much aware of the internal dynamics operant in his personality configuration, and thus definitely not a person who could be categorized as being psychiatrically ill. The good-lying doctors went on to finish their report with the following recommendation. It is anticipated that Mr. Mead will make a satisfactory adjustment to confinement as long as he does not perceive himself as being singled out for discriminatory negative attention and is allowed to live as any other resident. Prison officials at the penitentiary would have been well advised to pay special heed to the wisdom of that recommendation, but of course they would not. Anyway, I was shipped out to the state penitentiary at Walla Walla, traveling in an old prison transport vehicle not so affectionately referred to as the Green Goose by its unwilling passengers. The bus carried a maximum of 21 people. It was August of 1976, and it was hot inside the fully loaded bus. Sweating prisoners were handcuffed to chains looped around their waists and connected to the similarly restrained man next to them. We all wore leg irons as well. This arrangement was called a chain. The trip took what seemed like 6 hours. During that time, if a prisoner had to use the toilet facilities, which consisted of an open and very smelly bucket at the back of the small bus, he got permission from a guard to shuffle like a penguin back to the bucket, where, with hands chained, they did their best to urinate as the bus merrily bounced its way over the bumpy highway. As the tiring journey came near an end, the passengers in the bus looked off into the direction of the prison with a strange mixture of dread and anxiousness. We were happy to be at the end of this unpleasant trip, yet felt considerable foreboding for what lies ahead. We had heard many terrible stories about the prison while in the county jail. The old-timers who had been to WSP before suddenly grew in stature, for they knew the ropes. Everyone was looking for the prison, and those who had been there were telling the rest of us where to look. When the prison finally came into view, I felt like I was seeing the outside of a place I would not be seeing the outside of again for a long time. I took a mental picture of the still distant prison and the surrounding area, just in case I might be able to, at some point, escape. The late afternoon sky was dark with humid clouds that appeared to want to burst into thunder. The land was flat, the endless wheat fields broken only by occasional outbuildings and the fences that separated them. We pulled up to the prison and entered the double-gated sally port. With the first gate closed behind us, prison guards casually inspected the bus for possible concealed weapons or other bulky forms of contraband. Then we were passed through the second set of gates and into the prison proper. We were ordered to disembark. Marching 2 by 2, the chain stepped off the bus and into the innards of the prison. Greeting us was a tough-voiced sergeant who read the new prisoners' names from a clipboard and barked orders regarding our housing assignments. Also greeting us was a gathering of bored Walla prisoners who used the weekly arrival of the chain as a mild diversion from the prison's humdrum daily routine. Some came to look for friends coming in from the county jail, and if they saw them, they would exchange greetings or instructions. Some came simply to gawk at the new fish, and some, the predators, came to look over the meat for possible prey, the young and more vulnerable newcomers who did not have any friends to protect them. Those who had partners on the inside would get shouts from their friends like, "Hey Bob, tell them you want to move into 6E21. I've already put in a kite for you." Others, the young and fair, might get embarrassing catcalls of one sort or another. "Oh, look at that one, ain't she pretty?" And so on. Those who had a place to go and friends were the lucky ones. The rest of us would immediately be placed in a 4-man cell with 3 strangers. And the cells were so small that the 3 already there generally resented the addition of the newcomer. I was one of those who knew no one at the prison, but at 33 I was also fairly old and con-wise enough to escape the notice of the sexual predators and their wannabe counterparts. When my name was called, I was given a cell number, had my chains and cuffs removed, and then followed those before me into the back door of the brick building. It was a clothing room. We were issued new clothing and some old but clean bedding, and directed out the front door. Those who had friends were picked up, and the reunion began. Those who had been there before knew where they were going, and went there either by themselves or with a newly made buddy from the county jail. I stood in front of the clothing room alone, looking out on the innards of the prison. Inmates wandered around in small groups, not acting as if they had any place to go. What struck me was the age and filthiness of the place. The many huge buildings were all made of red brick. Just about everything on the ground level looked dirty and crowded. The place impressed me as having been put together without much planning. The buildings were designed in different styles, reflecting the age in which they were built. The old ones, you could tell from their architectural style, were quite old, and their bricks and concrete at the lower levels were chipped and falling away. Small swirls of dust and litter blew across a big, dirt-filled open area, which I would later learn was People's Park. I suddenly felt more insecure and insignificant than I had felt in a long time. I was also experiencing a fear that I would never leave this terrible place, that I would be trapped in this little space for a lifetime. With the blowing dust gritting between my dry teeth, I threw my bundle up on my shoulders and ventured out into the prison. I asked a passing inmate how to find 6. 6 Wing was a huge cell block containing stacked tiers of what should have been one-man cells, but which were crowded with 4 prisoners. It was like a beehive, abuzz with the sound of men settling in for the soon-to-come evening count. The air was bad with the smell of too many bodies, the poor ventilation not being able to keep up with the load, and the inadequate lighting contributed to the hive-like atmosphere of the building. I found my way to the cell that was assigned to me without too much trouble. It was occupied by a man who I would later learn was a jailhouse lawyer called Doc. Doc's other cell partners were kitchen workers and would not return until later in the evening. We had a brief but friendly talk until count time was announced over the cell block's loudspeakers, whereupon the goon squad suddenly appeared at the bars in front of the cell. They ordered me out, cuffed my hands behind my back, and then escorted me to Big Red, the name prisoners gave to the 2-story brick building that was the institution's segregation unit. It appeared as if I was indeed going to be singled out for discriminatory negative attention. Being processed into the hole was not much different than all of the other forms of degradation prisoners must experience on a daily basis. As it happened, there was another prisoner being processed when I entered the unit. We each had to remove all of our clothing in front of the gawking guards and then allow them to look into our mouths and ears, lift our scrotum and penis so they can examine under them, turn around, bend over, and spread the cheeks of our ass so they can supposedly check to see if there's any contraband hidden inside us. The other guy being processed with me was a few years younger than me and more slightly built. I didn't speak to him, nor he to me, as each of us were caught up in our own humiliations. When the guards were done with us, they threw us each a pair of oversized blue coveralls and led us to B tier, one of the 4 tiers making up the whole. I was assigned to cell 13, the other guy was put next door to me in cell 14. I looked around the tiny cell. It was dank, painted barf green, and filthy. There was a more or less round patch of brown, mud-like material smeared on the wall over the bunk. It was about 3 feet in diameter. I could tell by the smell and texture that it was human fecal matter. Shit. It took a moment for the shock to wear off. Then I yelled out to the guard, telling them that I wanted a different cell. After a while, a guard came into the tier and I showed him the filthy wall and demanded to move. He told me that there would be no cell change, as such matters were ordered by the assignment officer and could not be changed. I then asked for cleaning materials, but was told that would have to be obtained during the following day, as his shift did not issue supplies. Temporarily resigned to my fate, I made my bunk and started cleaning the cell as best I could without actually touching any of the bug-infested, shit-smeared walls. Supper had just been served in the segregation unit, and most of the 24 prisoners on the tier were either taking naps or reading. It was mostly quiet, with only an occasional snatch of conversation between the cells. No one paid any attention to me. It must have been around 7 o'clock in the evening when they started letting selected prisoners out for their 1-hour exercise periods. While I didn't know it at the time, most prisoners on B tier spent 23 hours a day in their cell, although there were about 6 men who served as trustees and spent considerably more time outside their cells, but still on the tier. These were the toughest men in the toughest prison in the state. Some of them were in the hole serving administrative segregation time or awaiting trial for murdering other prisoners. I did not pay a whole lot of attention to what was going on outside my cell, traffic of prisoners exercising and talking with other friends on the tier. One guy stopped by my cell on his way to the front of the tier to use the phone. He said his name was Danny Atterbury, and that he and a couple of others on the tier were in the hole for participating in the December 1974 takeover. He said he knew of me, and of course was supportive of the work the George Jackson Brigade had been doing on their behalf. He named the other rioters and hostage-takers as Joe Green, Mark LaRue, and, to some extent, Carl Harp. I knew most of the names of these men and was happy to learn that there were some friends on the tier. At about 9 o'clock that evening, events took a very ugly turn. A gang of about 6 prisoners decided they wanted to rape the prisoner in the cell next to mine, the kid who was booked into the seg unit with me. I could not believe my ears when the sound of their efforts to get his door open invaded my peaceful reality. The guard on the end of the tier was at the lockbox trying to open the door of cell 14 so that these guys could get in and rape him. I sprang from my bunk and looked out the bars at the front of the cell at the unfolding scene. The victim was holding a book in the bars, preventing the sliding door from opening. His attackers were trying to grab the book, he'd pull it back, the guard would attempt to open the door again, and my neighbor would stick the book back in the bars. The rapo gang of prisoners, led by a muscularly built man awaiting trial for murder, then went to the sink at the end of the tier and obtained a pitcher of hot water, which they threw on the man trying to defend himself. Still, he would not let them get the book, or to stay far enough away from the bars for the guard to be able to open it. I was afraid to shout out in the other man's defense, fearful that the mob would turn on me. I just stood there, wallowing in anguish for both of us, and hating myself for not taking a more firm stand. Who knows, had I gone on much longer, or if they had gained entrance to the cell, I may have actually done something, like demanding that they stop. On the other hand, maybe I would have continued to tremble in fear. But the guard gave up, and that ended all hope of the prisoners getting into the younger man's cell. It isn't often that I am confronted with an ethical or moral issue that also appears to be a question of life and death. It is not a good feeling. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, my cell door was opened and I was released, along with the men on each side of me, for my 1-hour exercise and shower period. The first thing I did was to clean the walls of the cell. I then went to talk to Atterbury, Green, and LaRue about the events of the night before. They shared my sense of outrage, but were unwilling to physically confront the gang of rapo killers. Only one man said he would take a fighting stand, and that was Carl Hart. He was understandably reluctant and his support shaky, but that was the start. I also talked to one of the old-timers on the tier, a respected prisoner and escape artist I will call Art. Art told me not to get too riled up about what was happening, as the kid was a punk anyway and would be giving his ass away if people weren't trying to take it. Art told me that at Walla, prisoners are raped all the time, even bought and sold by other prisoners. That's the way it is. I was amazed and answered that this attitude must be altered if we are ever to make progress at changing conditions in the whole. While it did not appear as if I made much progress during my hour, I later learned that Danny, Art, and the others spent their time on the tier talking to members of the gang about what is right and wrong for prisoners to be doing. The change was not deep, but a new mood nonetheless came into being on the tier. The followers had fallen away from the rapo leader, which was a positive development. On the negative side, the big rapo took this turn of events as a challenge to his masculinity, and he clearly saw me as the cause of the change. It seemed to me that he decided that in order to prove himself a real man, he must rape my neighbor. It may sound dumb today, but back then maleness was not something that was biologically determined, but rather manliness was a state of being that had to be reinforced and proven every day, most often at someone else's expense. The next morning, the rapo was out on the tier first. He promptly set up camp in front of the bars of my cell and started his exercise routine, jumping rope directly in front of me. His shirt was off and his massive muscles rippled with sweat as he worked out like the professional he was. In addition to being a well-developed weightlifter, my new friends would soon tell me that this guy had been a professional boxer on the streets. This demonstration of the rapo's prowess certainly scared me, but when it was my turn to exercise, I took the jump rope down in front of his cell and did my rather pathetic workout. I was skinny and not at all tough, yet I wanted to communicate the fact that he was not going to be able to make his move without some resistance from me. I did not particularly like the kid in the cell next to me. It was not for him that I was doing this. It was for the principle that preying on each other must be stopped. That afternoon, I found out that the rapo had his yard period changed so that he would be out on the tier with me and the kid the following morning. That night, I got very little sleep. I was certain that come morning, I would either die or be badly beaten up by this much stronger and far more vicious man. Morning finally came, of course, and when my door opened, I stepped out onto the tier, determined to put up as good a fight as I was capable of. The rapo had never spoken to me, and this particular morning was no exception. He went about his business of exercising as if I wasn't there. He did talk to the kid, but no rape took place. When it was time to lock up again, I entered the cell with a great sense of relief. A day or two later, the rapo put in a move slip to be transferred to another tier, and he was gone soon after that. I subsequently learned that the reason he did not attack me was that I had succeeded in winning over public opinion on the tier. The George Jackson Brigade's bombing attack on the headquarters of the Department of Corrections and the FBI office in Tacoma, and other actions of the Brigade, had landed me a certain amount of moral authority on B tier. To have hurt or killed me would have been very bad politics on the part of the rapo. The cost of his not having done so was also expensive. His position as the prison's top dog was no longer intact. A short time later, while supposedly giving him a nose hit from a joint, two prisoners I will call Kevin and Andy, former members of his rapo entourage who had since joined him on D tier, attacked him with knives. He was badly stabbed but survived the assault. In any case, he was no longer a threat to me, although Kevin and Andy would subsequently prove to be serious obstacles in the path of prisoner organizing. But that was in the future at this point. Right then, my only thoughts were of trying to build something that would move things forward. As days melted into months, I fell into the day-to-day routine of life on B tier, and to some extent was able to communicate with prisoners on the other 3 tiers of Big Red through the vents located in the back of each of our cells. But mostly I did a lot of talking with our fellow cons on the tier, particularly Danny, Joe, Mark, and Carl, all of whom had participated in the December 1974 takeover of sections of the prison. I learned that there had been long periods of spontaneous resistance to conditions and segregation, a resistance that sometimes took violent forms. From what I could gather, the battle had run hot and cold, sort of like the principal seasons were in that remote corner of Washington state. A few months earlier, there had been tough fighting, a guard or two having been taken hostage by Seg prisoners, convicts being beaten by their captors, prisoners throwing fecal matter on the cops as they came onto the tier, and the cops putting urine, bleach, and soap chips in the food and drink before serving it to the lockdown prisoners. Then, at some point, there would be a change, a few token concessions tossed out by the warden, and the season of struggle would suddenly change again to one of peace and cooperation. Many of those who had participated in the earlier protests, like Kevin and Andy, would become friends with the cops, or at least certain of them, and those guards, our former enemies, would in turn pull trips like opening the prisoner's door for the attempted rape that took place on my first night in the unit. At that particular moment, the season was currently one of peace between the keepers and the kept in Walla Walla's segregation unit. That was the time when we most often victimized each other. There was another young kid on B tier, an innocent 20-year-old whose principal crime was probably one of being more confused than those around him. The youngster did not bother anyone else in the tier, and for the brief time he was with us, tried to mind his own business. One night, two guys on the tier, a couple of the wannabe toughs, passed themselves off as newfound friends to the kid by giving him some barbiturates. Once the young man was groggy from the drugs, the two of them went into his open cell and raped him. Then, in an effort to conceal their crime, they made him take a shower. Upon his return to the cell, the two of them strangled the kid to death, then tied one end of a bedsheet around the victim's neck and the other end to the bars, and arranged the body so as to make it appear as if the youngster had committed suicide. While the police did not fall for the suicide ruse, they charged and convicted only one prisoner with the kid's murder. The other one made parole a short time later and went home. I've seen this sort of thing happen on more than one occasion. Someone kills and or rapes another person, and then is turned right around and released. It was not the release, but the murder that so deeply disturbed me. Why did that happen? Why did prisoners prey on each other like that? One possible clarification, at least one that provided me with some measure of understanding, came from Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Fanon was an Algerian psychiatrist who was educated in France during the period France colonized his homeland. He wrote about his observations of the process through which his people developed the capacity to struggle against French imperialism. I will badly paraphrase what Mr. Fanon had to say on the subject of violence among the oppressed. The phenomena is essentially part of a much-needed cleansing process, one that prepares a nation for the struggle for liberation and revolution. The Algerians in Fanon's book, not unlike blacks in the ghettos of America or prisoners in the nation's gulags, internalized the oppression they were experiencing and tended to take it out on each other in the form of what could be characterized as acts of self-hatred. This was not that unusual, considering the fact that the tribal people of Algeria considered the French colonialists to be gods of sorts who could not be killed. Fanon noted that at first this violence manifested itself through intra-family conflicts, husbands beating their wives, women violently abusing their children, and so on. This domestic violence, according to Fanon, then slowly transformed itself into intra-tribal conflict. Men within the tribe drank and fought with each other, resulting in many deaths and injuries. The next phase of the process was one of intertribal violence, where now more or less united tribes fought against each other. As the process continued to unfold, the tribes, now united in the application of violence, came together for the final phase. They started fighting the French occupiers and were eventually able to drive the foreign army from their land. While I had some appreciation as to why prisoners would be preying on each other, I was nonetheless angry at the prisoner who killed the weaker youngster. The killer could not understand why I was so pissed, why his act of murdering someone else, not even a friend of mine, would bother me. He and I did not get along well after that. He was one of those people who for all his miserable life had been told he was a piece of shit, and he was treated accordingly. He ended up believing it and behaved like a piece of shit. He had a lot of company in that regard, too. So there were conflicting trends in Big Red and the prison in general. On the one hand, there is this kind of cannibalism with the prisoners raping and killing each other. and, on the other hand, just as intense periods of blind, self-destructive resistance. I wanted to make prisoners more conscious and to lower their self-destructiveness. I knew it was going to be an uphill struggle. Not too long after my placement on B tier of Big Red, my direct appeal from the federal bank robbery conviction was pending in the U.S. Court of Appeals. I was acting as my own attorney on the appeal, as I did at trial, and had only a narrow time window within which to file my opening brief. The rules of the appeals court mandates that all briefs must be commercially printed using an offset press. There were no laser printers and fancy word processors in those days. But in the case of indigent prisoners, an exception was made. We could submit briefs prepared with only a typewriter. The problem is that there were no typewriters available to prisoners in Big Red, and my constant requests to the administration to provide me with a temporary use of one were routinely denied. Accordingly, I was forced to file a motion in the U.S. District Court in Spokane, Washington, asking the federal judge to issue an order directing that I be given access to a typewriter for the limited purpose of perfecting my then pending appeal. The judge did issue the requested order, commanding that Warden B.J. Ray permit me to use an institutional typewriter for the purpose of typing my appellate brief. The warden ignored the court order. I reapplied to the court and received another order, this one providing a concrete deadline for compliance. The deadline came and went, and still there was no typewriter. I next filed a motion asking that Warden Ray be found to be in contempt of court for his refusal to honor the court's orders. Subpoenas were issued for both of us, and a contempt hearing was held at the federal courthouse in Spokane. The judge put the warden on the witness stand and found him to be in contempt of court. But the judge went on to tell Ray that he could purge himself of his contempt by merely providing me with access to a typewriter. The warden said, "Okay," and we all went back to the joint. I still didn't get the typewriter. I filed yet another motion detailing the history of this issue and emphasizing the dwindling time frame within which my opening brief had to be filed. The court responded by rescinding all of its previous orders, leaving me with no typewriter and no avenue for relief. The warden had successfully worn down the judge's resolve and in the process once again defended the prison's tradition of being a law unto itself, immune to the rules that govern other agencies. What I was not able to win in the courts, I was able to achieve through persistent political effort. I did eventually manage to get an old state typewriter into my segregation cell. Perhaps B.J. Ray could see further than the judge, as once my appeal was done, I used a machine to put out a typewritten newsletter aimed at my fellow prisoners there in the hole. Typing away in my cell and making as many carbon copies as I could, I wrote about the terrible conditions in Big Red, what it would take to change them, and who the real enemy is. I'll leave it to the reader's imagination to visualize the type of rhetoric I used back in those days. However clumsy my language may have been, though, it did get the message across to my desperate readers. The paper was surreptitiously passed from tier to tier, and then from cell to cell. Other prisoners wrote articles too, adding their voice to the call for a fight back. A struggle soon emerged. It was while I was in the segregation unit that I got the idea of starting an organization aimed at ending prisoner-on-prisoner rape. Although I had not yet spent much time in Walla Walla's general population, the steady flow of prisoners in and out of the hole, along with my own experiences in segregation, convinced me that the principal contradiction among prisoners was sexism, not white racism, as is the case at so many other institutions. But before any formal organizing could take place, I would first have to get out of the hole. My little newspaper continued to slowly influence the 96 men in Big Red. The struggle over the terrible conditions, beatings, the lack of programs, 23-hour-a-day lockup, poor sanitation, etc., intensified. Unity grew. We launched a series of meager work strikes in which seg porters refused to clean. We wrote victory slogans on the walls of the unit, threw trash on the tiers and then burned it, filed lawsuits in federal court, and flooded the place by stopping up the toilets with sheets and then repeatedly flushing them. There were hunger strikes, demands submitted to prison officials, and articles written to progressive publications on the outside, such as Seattle's Northwest Passage. This trend developed until all 4 tiers of the unit were working with what amounted to a single-minded objective. We saw ourselves as being in what could be termed a continuous state of war with our captors. Slowly, taking 1 step backwards for every 2 steps forward, making mistakes and learning as we fought on, many of us came to believe that we could win. We knew that what was being done to us was terribly wrong, and we came to the understanding that salvation would be achieved through ongoing struggle. We called ourselves the Walla Brothers. In each segregation cell there was a metal table that, when struck with the fleshy part of a clenched fist, produced a deep reverberation up and down the tier. It was a loud noise, one that had a rich depth of substance to it. I don't remember whose idea it was or how it came about, as the years have erased so many of these memories. But at the height of one particularly bitter and protracted round of strikes and protests, we came to the conclusion that in order to prevail, we would have to enlist the support of the population. Saying words to them would not be enough. It was only talk. Many people in the population had read our manifesto and the articles we had written on the nature of our brutalization in the big red hellhole. But what we said and wrote was just not enough to move them from a position of understanding and sympathy to that of direct and self-sacrificing support. We needed something more. The drums did it. We knew what time the population was released from the cell blocks, one tier at a time, to walk to the mess hall and eat their meals. While one drummer was loud, a tier of 24 of them, banging together in rhythmic unison, was both a near-deafening and an empowering experience. And with 4 tiers of 24 men each doing it, the awesome sound was like waves of thunder rolling across the prison compound. Every day we did this, during each meal, until the balls of our fists were raw and painful. And still we banged on, not passively, like survivors trapped in the bowels of a capsized ocean liner, sending out periodic bumps for would-be rescuers, but rather we pounded like fighters, beating out a confident call to comrades to join us in a most glorious struggle for justice. Our reward was pretty quick in coming. After some 3 or 4 days of periodic pounding on our metal tables, days in which our captors did everything within their power to shut us up, we received word that the entire population was on a work strike. They had issued a list of 14 demands. The first item on that list was a demand to rectify specified conditions in the segregation unit. The fat was now in the fire. We and the whole were at first ecstatic over this latest turn of events, and rightly so. But the joy was quickly replaced with a dogged determination to win what was now a major political struggle. We had to redouble our efforts on all fronts, limited as they might be. Our energy was quickly devoted to cranking out more articles and supporting, in the small ways we could, our brothers in the population who were on strike. The strike lasted for 47 days, the longest in state history. We would probably have needed to go on even longer had we not gotten some valuable armed support from the George Jackson Brigade. On day 43, the brigade exploded a bomb at night in the safety deposit box of a branch of the Rainier Bank in Seattle. The resulting blast got the attention of the powers that be. The George Jackson Brigade's accompanying communique to Seattle's radio stations gave them the message. The document pointed out how there was an interlocking directorship between the Rainier Bank and the publisher of the state's leading newspaper, the Seattle Times. The communique pointed out that on nearly every one of the 43 days the prisoners at Walla had been on strike, the news media carried completely one-sided stories about the event, including interviews with prison officials, guards, and various other forms of anti-prisoner propaganda. But never once during the unfolding course of this significant news event was the prisoner's side of the story ever told. Not once was a single word of a prisoner quoted. The communique promised to continue bombing Rainier Banks until Seattle Times adopted a more even-handed approach to their coverage of the story. Well, you wouldn't believe the sudden turnaround in the mood of the state's population. Whereas on day 42 of the strike and on all of those before it, there was never so much as a hint that the prisoners might have a legitimate set of gripes. On day 44, a prisoner was finally interviewed. I don't even think he was a part of the inside population, but one of the farm workers outside the walls. In any case, his few words were enough to start a statewide debate and to unleash what would soon be a flood of facts regarding the outrageous conditions of our existence. How legitimate were our complaints? Solid enough for public opinion to get behind us to the point that the Secretary of the Department of Corrections in the state capitol was fired, as was Warden B.J. Ray in the penitentiary. The Associate Warden of Custody, the man in charge of Big Red, was transferred to work at the kids' joint at Shelton, and we were all released from the hole, although not all at once. When I tell this story, it sounds like we had brave prisoners marching in unity and brotherhood towards the greater goals of goodness and decency. I don't want to idealize this period. Of course, there were elements of unity and struggle, sharing our common boredom, the occasional rush of success, and the frequent setbacks. There are also the underlying contradictions among prisoners on the tier. They manifested themselves through acts of violence, both real and threatened. There is a small but vocal group of prisoners who appeared to dislike me, and who, out of mere boredom, were looking to kill someone. There were times when I felt they were after me. This fear was strong enough to cause me to keep a homemade knife and to have something like a big book near the door that I could use to prevent it from sliding open. The memory of the attempted rape of my neighbor was always fresh in my mind. The general atmosphere of violence in that place was totally alien and foreign to anything I had ever experienced before. My fear of this particular group came from the way they suddenly stopped talking as they came by my cell, the manner in which they would furtively glance into my cell as if stalking me, on the intricacies of power politics as practiced on the tier, on who's on what side, who wants to kill whom, and on who had already killed whom in the past. The small group of us calling ourselves the Walla Walla Brothers did everything we could to communicate a sense of struggle to other people on the tier. One day, Danny took ketchup and, using it as paint, wrote, "We will win," in big letters on the burn-scarred back wall of the tier. This lettering can be seen on page 147 of Hoffman and McCoy's book, Concrete Mama. We put up posters, I did my newsletter, we all talked to people one-on-one, and on occasion I even tried to get guys on the tier to sing politically inspirational songs. Yet, with all this and much more, there were long periods in which it seemed that nobody was listening to us, that nothing we were doing would have an impact on reality. Not only was the prison administration not giving an inch, they instead intensified their efforts to take away from us what little we had left. At the same time, some of the prisoners would continue to prey on each other in all sorts of ways. When this would change, when people were at their best, was when our material conditions were at their worst. Being stripped of everything but your undershorts, enduring fires on the tier, the stench of urine on the walls mixed with the smoke from the fires, and the beatings inflicted by the guards. The bottom line was often reduced to one of total resistance, nothing between them and us except near perfect hatred. I would feel good when we were together like that, and when the situation was one of clear and indisputable injustice. I still vividly remember being in the third or fourth day of a hunger strike, or all of us rattling the bars of our cages together and hollering as a single voice. At those times, it was clear who the enemy was, and we would feel powerful in spite of our stark conditions of existence. So life for me in Big Red during those days vacillated between fear and despair on the one hand versus exhilaration and hope on the other. And of course, there were both the dull and the exciting times in between the two extremes of this duality. It was within this context I started exploring the feminine aspect of my nature, coming out to myself and the people around me as a homosexual, and learning to accept that in myself. Some of these men I disliked, others of them I loved. I wanted the capacity and the freedom to deepen these latter feelings by giving them a sexual expression. However, homosexuals and anything feminine were really looked down upon in prison. Woman-like behavior or mannerisms were considered to be a sign of weakness, and those who displayed it were fair game for victimization. The very worst insult one could call someone was to equate them with a woman's sexuality, a bitch, cunt, etc. Women were never referred to in any complimentary way. It was a case of the totally powerless seeking some way through which they could obtain some semblance of control by oppressing others perceived as being less strong than themselves. About the best most prisoners could muster would be to refer to a woman they knew as a girl. Gays were objects of derision. In the prison's hierarchy of status, homosexuals were just a step above child molesters. My coming out was not the result of some driving sexual desire for men or any individual man. It was more the product of a rational, intellectual, and political decision that slowly formulated itself in my consciousness. I had just returned to prison with a double life sentence and a relatively high consciousness of women's issues. I decided that women did not need yet another man to drain their energy, that if my emotional and sexual needs were going to be met, they would be met by men. I had occasionally had sex with men in the past while living on the outside, so the notion of sex with men wasn't at all abhorrent to me. At the same time, the notion of organizing men against sexism was germinating in my brain. I don't know if that sounds opportunist or not, adjusting my sexual attitudes to fit the group of people I most wanted to reach, but I wanted to stop sexual slavery in the prison, and I would do it as a member of the victim group rather than as an outsider. Furthermore, I genuinely loved people like Danny Araberry, Mark LaRue, Carl Harp, and Joe Green. I loved them as intensely as I feared so many other people on the tier. One of the things that fed my fear was that in most situations you could deal with violence. There would be a set of rules, even if irrational, so that one could nonetheless learn to live with the threat. But the violence at Walla Walla didn't follow any rules. It was random, senseless, and over stupid things not worth a second word. So I feared that it would strike me, and I didn't feel confident enough that I could effectively deal with the confrontations that even at the best of times seemed to loom just near the edge of my awareness. In a word, I was insecure. I didn't know what else to do but to throw myself and all the strength I could gather up against the administration. If I was to go down, it would be at the hands of my real enemies, the government and the tiny class that controls it, not the confused products of their system. When I had doubts as to whether I'd survive the next day, when the hatred, bitterness, and tension on the tier became too oppressive, I'd do what I could to intensify the struggle against our captors. My thinking was that if somebody was going to knife me in the back, it would at least be clear that their having done so was an act of open collaboration with the pigs. I've been trying to convey a sense of what it was like to live on the tier during those days, and it is a hard task because a lot of things don't make that much sense. The bottom line is that, after 9 months in the hole, my friends and I were released to the general population. We'd survived one hell and were on the threshold of another. We now had a freshly appointed secretary of the Department of Corrections in Olympia, a more liberal warden, and a new associate warden of custody. We also had a collective measure of respect from most prisoners because of the successful seg struggle. But for me and some of my friends, nothing had really changed. Just as coming from the streets to prison had merely been a change in fronts on which to fight, so too in our eyes was the mood from seg to the population. There was still much work to be done.
In every state line, there's a new set of laws, and every policeman comes equipped with extended claws. There's 1,000 shades of white and 1,000 shades of black.